if you got your little phone there, we're going to go to Matthew in the Christmas story. We're going to start in verse 1, verses 24 and 25. Matthew 1, verses 24 and 25. Now, this is just, you know the story, so, but sometimes it's good to look. I need to get to Matthew. I'm in Luke. All right. It says, and Joseph awoke, right? This is after he finds out he's going to put Mary away quietly. You know, he's a good person. So Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him and took Mary as his wife, but kept her virgin until she gave birth to her son, and he named him Jesus. Now go with me to the next chapter, chapter 2. Look with me in verse 13. It says, now when they had gone, behold, an angel, this is after the wise men leave, the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up and take your child and the mother and go to Egypt and stay there until I tell you, because Herod's looking for the kid to kill him. Then if you go down in verse 20, it says, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. Now here's the things that I kind of wrote down. First of all, what can we learn about leadership when it comes to Joseph? Good leadership has to endure public ridicule. Right? Mary was pregnant. Do you think everybody believed Mary and Joseph when they said, don't worry, it's the Holy Spirit? No, they thought that Mary was a prostitute, okay, and that Joseph was crazy. And yet, he had to endure that obediently in order to be a leader. There are things that leaders must do that are not going to be understood. We want to do our best to cast vision. We want to do our best, but there are things that we have to do. It's just like a parent. There are certain things you have to do no matter how much you explain them to your child. Doesn't mean you shouldn't explain it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't cast vision. They're not going to understand. It's not going to make sense, and it's going to seem unfair. That's hard to experience, but it's also hard to do unless you have a more dictatorial spirit, all right? But you have to endure public ridicule. Also notice in verses 24 to 25 that you have to be willing to discipline yourself when it comes to personal pleasure. Because remember what it said, if you look back and verse 25 of chapter 1, but kept her a virgin until she gave birth to her son. Right? So Mary and Joseph get married, but they're not sexually intimate. Why? Because God said not to. Now think about the amount of discipline that takes. Think about the amount of discipline in our world that takes even before you get married. Right? The scripture is really, really clear that we're to be sexually pure until we get married, and yet there's all this temptation, there's all this challenge, right? And so here they do get married. Mary's already pregnant, so it's not as if something's going to happen or that anybody's going to know other than Mary, Joseph, and God. And yet, he disciplines himself when it comes to the idea of pleasure, right? Right? And we know, well, I don't know that we know. That's not necessarily easy to do, right? Just ask Brandon or Larry, all right? It can happen pretty quickly. So you have to endure public ridicule. You have to be willing to discipline yourself. And then remember, they went to Egypt. You got to be willing to start over. And you got to choose obedience over comfort. Those are all things that Joseph did. And guess what? Joseph is seldomly honored, is he? How many stories do you hear about Joseph? And how many times is Joseph lifted up? And Joseph evidently died young, or he was old when he married Mary, but you don't hear much about him later in the story. And yet, he led in all these things. You think when Joseph went to Mary and said, Mary, we're going to Egypt, she said, I can't wait to get there? Or she said, what are you thinking? I just had a baby. You want us to go to Egypt? We don't know anybody in Egypt. What are we going to do in Egypt? Where are we going to live? Where are we going to stay? How are we going to survive? And then they're there a few years and he says, hey, let's go back to Israel. She's like, I just got some friends. Right? And so I think there's a lot that we can learn And then he had to have the humility, because you know where he ended up? In Nazareth. That's where he started. He had to go home. Now, he went home because he was being obedient to what God wanted him to do. What do you think everybody else thought? Let's see, you've lived in Bethlehem, you've ran to Egypt, you started for Galilee, and now you're back in Nazareth. You're just a failure, right? And he had to humble himself enough to be obedient to God to go back home, knowing that everybody was probably going to think that the reason he was going back home is because he couldn't make it anywhere else. Right. And so again, I'm just reminding us that when it comes to leadership, that a lot of times the world or even our family or our friends aren't going to necessarily understand what God is calling us to do. And our skin may not want to do it because it takes humility. I think it took humility for Joseph as a man, especially, to go back home after living in so many different places because that's where God wanted him to be when everybody else thought he was there because he couldn't succeed maybe in other places. Let's quickly look at Mary. And if we look at Mary's story, we can go to Luke, right? Chapter 2. And I just want us to look at start off verses 4 and 5. It says, now Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house of the family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was betrothed to him and was pregnant. You know, one of the things that I don't think we talk a lot about, but when it comes to Mary, is these verses remind us that Mary understood authority. Again, when Joseph went to her, do you think as a pregnant woman, those of you who have been pregnant, her thought was, let me get on a donkey and ride several miles for a census? And yet the scripture reminds us that she went along with Joseph. She was counted a part of Joseph's family. She was supportive of Joseph. She understood authority. And one of the things that it's important when it comes to leadership is our willingness to submit and follow authority. I wrote down, she gave Joseph a great Christmas gift, because even though it seemed like it was a bad idea, it was the right idea. In other words, it makes no sense to be pregnant, get on a donkey, ride hundreds of miles, and yet that's exactly what God wanted them to do so that the baby could be born where the baby was born because it fulfilled a prophecy. It's kind of like the roundabout way. What do we do in 2024 when we go the roundabout way? We often give up. We often surrender. We often complain. We often doubt. We often get frustrated, right? We go through all of these emotions, and you probably know that most people, when they find themselves on a donkey, pregnant, a long way from home, with the baby being put in a feed trough, they figure they must be in the wrong place. They must need to do something else. And yet God had them right where he wanted them to be. That hopefully is not a discouraging thought, but it's an encouraging thought, because we all go through those seasons in life. We all go through those times where God is maturing us, right? James tells us what? That our maturity comes as a result of what? Trials. He says, let us rejoice when we go through trials. And yet so many times we give up when we go through trials. We get negative when we go through trials. We get discouraged when we go through trials. We stop persevering when we go through trials. And yet the trials are the very thing that perfect us for the success or the destiny that God has for us. It's important to remember, and it's easy to say amen to when somebody else is going through the trial. But again, you live in a culture unlike the American culture, let's say, for the past, because you live in a culture that values victimhood. You listen to people on television, you read celebrities in magazines, or you watch influencers on Instagram, YouTube, Twitch, or wherever it is you want to go. How many times those with great success talk about their victimhood, talk about how difficult their life is, how challenging it is, how overwhelming it is, how unfair it is, even though from your perspective, it seems that they've had great success. Now, here's how that affects all of us. We all then realize that victimhood gets us the empathy that makes us not have to deal with the challenge or the struggle. And so just know I'm going to face that in this culture, and you're going to face that in that culture. And yet, Mary was exactly where God wanted them to be. The Israelites were exactly where God wanted them to be because he wanted to do something in them. How do you deal with it? Well, if you go back a chapter to chapter 1, I think the answer is here. This is what's unique about Mary that I think helped her to deal with this. 34. But the angel says, you're going to have a baby, and Mary does two things. The first thing she does in verse 34 is she says, how will this be since I'm a virgin? Leaders aren't afraid to ask questions for clarity. Aren't afraid, because again, that takes what? Humility. Because your skin says what? Your skin says, well, if I was a good leader, I should know what I'm supposed to do or how I'm supposed to respond. But Mary wasn't, and think who she's talking to, an angel, right? And that had to take a lot of courage to say, I'm not sure what you're saying can happen because I'm a virgin. So as a leader, I can't be afraid to say, I don't get it. I don't understand. I don't see the connection. Help me understand the correlation. All right. So that I can grow because again, the biggest enemy to my growth is my ego, my unwilling to be honest about where I am so I can get where God wants me to go. Look with me, go back to chapter 2. This is how I think we deal with this emotional stuff that happens inside of us. It says in verse 19 of chapter 2, when the angel came, but Mary treasured all these things, pondering them in her heart. The secret weapon of Mary and of leaders is the ability to reflect, is the ability to think. Because, see, in order to reflect, it takes humility. You can't reflect unless you're willing to admit that maybe you're wrong. There's no sense reflecting if you can't be wrong, if you couldn't have messed up, if you couldn't have made a bad decision. And it doesn't mean you have to live. There's nothing you can do to change the decision or the response or the action or whatever it is that you and I did, said, went, thought, whatever. But without reflection, we can't grow. Without thinking through. And a lot of times the thing, and we don't think of it this way, but the thing that keeps us from reflecting is arrogance. Because it's painful to reflect on wrong turns, on a willingness to make a bad decision. It's painful to reflect on our own ego or insecurities or anger or inability to deal with our temper or that sense of worthlessness. It also takes discipline because thinking takes time and everybody's busy. It's like I was saying earlier, if we're going to grow, we have to do what in the moment doesn't seem like growth. It seems like a distraction from what we're trying to get done. And thinking or reflection is one of those things. Is to say, I'm going to stop and I'm going to think through this. Right? I'm going to think through the future. I'm going to think through what I'm feeling. I'm going to think through why this is happening. I'm going to reflect upon the challenges I'm facing. Because in the moment, a lot of things feel unfair that when you think about them or reflect or whatever word you want to use, you come out to a different place. But you have to make the time and you have to be humbling. Let me give you just a few more. Let's look at Herod real quick. This is, if you look at Matthew chapter 2, because we're just going to Luke and Matthew. So if you go to Matthew chapter 2, it says, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, the Magi from the east came and they asked, where's the king born? The king of the Jews, for we saw a star and we've come. And notice what it says in verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled and all of Jerusalem with him. And all of Jerusalem with him. That's interesting phrasing, isn't it? I think one of the leadership lessons that we can learn from Herod is to understand your own influence. Right? How many times do we as parents or friends or pastors, again, not think through the impact of our influence? Right? My grandkids are going to respond to me differently than my kids did because that relationship's different. You're going to respond to me differently than the sales clerk at Walmart, right? Because my influence is different in all of those environments, just as your influence is different in all of those environments. I can walk into this room, right? And there are certain folks in this room that are seen as leaders, and your energy level will determine the rest of the energy level in this room. And as a leader, you have to be aware of that influence. Because Herod's insecurity, the whole community took on. Do you think that made that an effective community to live in? Right? So if I'm fearful and I'm in an influential position, I got to be aware of that as a leader because I'm going to bring that fear or that anger or that frustration or that discouragement or that. And so I want to be real and I want to be willing to be vulnerable. But as a leader, I have to take on the willingness to intentionally not um, reveal my frustration or my fear or my insecurity. And the only way I can do that is if I'm humble enough to reflect upon what I did the last time I was in that position. That's the only way you get better, right? And it's why most people aren't leaders. It's why most ministries don't grow. It's why the world's going to hell. It's because it takes a lot of work to be an effective leader, an effective parent. My dad would come home and the whole environment in our house would change. I remember when our kids were little and I would come home and I have to stop in the driveway because I knew that whatever I brought into the house is the way the evening was going to feel. And that's unfair to Stephanie. That's unfair to the kids. When I come in here, the way I respond, the way I react is going to impact the way the room feels. It's going to impact what you then take to your ministry or maybe even what you then take home. Now, that's not fair. I ought to be able to come, if you want to talk about fairness, come in here when I'm frustrated and be frustrated, or when I'm discouraged, be discouraged, or when I'm tired, be tired. But I accepted the role as leader, and in accepting that role, I have a responsibility to the one who gave me the role, right? And so do you. Nobody made you be a pastor. Nobody made you come to this meeting. You said God called you and you signed up to be a part of it. And the reality is therefore you have influence. And it looks different, but it's real in every room that you step in. Herod, he teaches us that because the whole city freaked out when he freaked out. Um, the other thing that Herod teaches us in verses 7 and 8, just go down, he secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And then he lies to him and said, tell me when the child's coming so I can go and worship him too. Here's the other thing, because we're from Herod, we really learn what not to do, is don't manipulate people. The better leader you become, the easier it becomes for you to manipulate the people around you. You don't even have to be a good leader. You can just be selfish, right? How many people manipulate their spouse? Because they know that if they act angry, their spouse will respond in a certain way. Or if they act sad, their spouse will respond in a certain way, right? And the reason they display the emotion they're displaying is because what they want from the people that they're leading, right? In other words, they're manipulating others with their emotion. It killed me, and I determined I was never going to do this because I'd be around pastors, and they would always manipulate people by presenting themselves as poor. Right? Like, "Oh, I wish I could afford to go on that vacation." Or, "Man, I wish I had a pair of nice shoes like that." Right? And you could tell that they were saying that around people who had the ability to provide those things. And that they were saying those things because they were hoping that as a result, they would provide them. Right? In again, everybody manipulates, so you have to, again, reflect. If you don't reflect, you won't even know you're doing it because the skin naturally, your skin, like mine, wants what it wants, right? My skin wants certain things. So does yours. And if you don't reflect, you won't necessarily be aware of the fact that you are manipulating the people around you, right? Some parents manipulate their kids with their anger. Their kids aren't responding because of they've grown in a mature way. Their kids are being manipulated to be good because of the emotions of the parents. So think about it. In that moment, the kids are doing right, but once there's no longer the fear, the kids are no longer going to do right. Right? Because without even realizing it, the parent has manipulated the child into doing what they want as opposed to teaching the child to do right and why to do right. You guys get what I'm saying? Manipulation is a word that we all know is bad and none of us think we do. But we all tend to do that. And one of the most profound ways in which you do it is your face. I'll never forget, I was at a leadership roundtable years and years ago, and Brian Houston was there. And he said one of the most important things in leadership is to control your face. Because, see, here's the thing. From where I'm standing, you're all saying something. And some of you may be saying things you really don't want to say. And you can become unaware of it. And that means it's not only something I feel, it's something you feel, and it's something the people you're leading feel. And if you're unaware of it, if you don't think about it, you don't grow in it. So I think Herod teaches us that. Then, the other thing I put there in verse 16, again, which same chapter. Then Herod saw that he had been tricked. He became enraged, and then he kills all the boys. Know your insecurities. We all have them, and we will all operate out of them. If you don't know what they are, you won't know when you're doing it. I can stand here and say, I just did a moment ago, I said, hey, I was at a round table with Brian Houston. Now, Brian Houston's not a big leader necessarily anymore today, but I can use his name because I don't feel as an effective leader, right? And I can use his name to try to hide my insecurity or somebody else's name, or I can use it because it's part of the story that I'm telling. But it's important that I take the time to think through, why did I say that? Right? Why? So that I can grow. You all know insecure people who are always talking about things, and when they say it, that they're saying it because they feel insecure about that. Business people always talk about what? Money. They always do. I mean, I've never been to a lunch with a business person that somehow didn't get some number thrown into what they were talking about. Why? Does that number mean anything to me? Right? I mean, I'm in a total, right? There's just this, again, this sense we're looking for the pecking order. All right, so I make this amount of money or I'm in this amount of shape. I mean, notice people fight about how sick they've been. There's always a pecking order. Well, I missed 3 days. I missed a whole month. Right? There's just this tendency in all of us, and our insecurity comes through. And insecurity is so destructive to ministry, to marriage, to parenting. Insecure parents raise insecure kids. Right? And we all are given to it because you're not perfect. Did you know that? You're not. You're not always going to win, and sometimes you're going to fail. And every time you do, the enemy's going to remind you of all of those. And if you're not careful, you will live out of your insecurity. Let's look at the Magi real quick. Chapter 2, verse 12 says, and after being warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country another way. It says earlier in the chapter that when they saw the star, they took off. And I think here's the thing we learn from the Magi is don't be afraid to act without having all the answers. They do it twice. They see a star, they take off, and the star disappears. So then they ask questions, right? They get Bethlehem. So they take off in that direction, but they don't see the star yet. Then the star appears, and they're like, oh, we're going in the right direction. If you're going to be a leader, you can't be afraid. The maturity is so important because you've got to be able to figure out when to act. How much information do you need to act? Some of us have our real love risk and we're ready to act without any information. That's called stupidity, right? You're just ready. Let's go. Others of us need so much information we never get around to acting, and we're always frustrating, right? Um, I used to go to school with a kid who always talked about how he wasn't going to get married or he wasn't going to have kids until he was financially stable. He's single without children. All right. Uh, uh, so there's this wisdom that you have to gain through maturity, but the wise men acted on a star. And then they got news, go to Bethlehem, from people they didn't know in a place they had never been. And they said, well, this is the best information we've got. And the value of seeing this new king is so important, we're going to act upon it. That's the reason we're doing what we're doing in the digital world. I don't know what the future of the church is, but I will tell you this, it has changed in the last 10 years around the world. And there are some churches, like 100,000 in the US, that have closed their doors. And I don't know if it's YouTube. I don't know if it's something out there that we have no idea what it is. I don't know what online, I don't know what a lot of that is. But what I do know is I want to take steps upon what we can see so as to discover the star. Had they never left, they would have never seen Jesus. And churches are bad about being afraid to take risk. They go to Herod and they ask the question. The other thing I just say real quickly is, again, don't be afraid to admit what you don't know. You don't have to know every answer about the Bible. You don't have to know every answer about the future. You don't have to know every answer about parenting. You don't have to know every answer about anything, as long as you're willing to admit you don't know. Don't be afraid to admit what you don't know. But it's a sin to stay ignorant and not look for answers. Don't just say, I don't know and I don't care, unless it's an area that's not, you're not moving in. But don't stay ignorant. I think a lot of folks are going to have to stand accountable to God. A lot of us are going to have to stand accountable to God for what we don't know, because we live in a time when knowledge is so accessible. The other thing is risk. Look what it says in verse 10. It says, they leave. It says, and when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And here's the way I put it in my notes. Risk is the cost of discovery. Risk is the cost of discovery. Right? You have to be willing to take risk, and with risk comes risk. Sometimes you fall. Sometimes you fail. Sometimes you screw up. But you can't discover something new if you're not willing to take a risk. Right? God's a God of grace. And last one. There's lots of people we could look at, but the last one's just the shepherds. If you go back to Luke, that's where their story is, right? Look what it says in verses 8 and 9. Luke 2. I got to stand in this field when we went to Israel a few years ago, and you could see it was really awesome. In the same region, there were some shepherds staying out in the fields, keeping watch over the flock at night. Verse 9, and an angel of the Lord suddenly stood near them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. Now, here's what shepherds teach me about leadership, is the extraordinary often breaks in through the ordinary. The extraordinary often breaks in the ordinary. They're out in the field just doing the hard work of shepherding. They had no idea that night that the angels were going to show up. Don't ever lose that. It's just a staff meeting. No. You never know when the extraordinary is going to break in and revival is going to break out. It's just another weekend. There are 52 of them every single year, plus all the other things we do. And it's so easy, right? When Jesus went to his hometown, he couldn't do any miracles. Why? Because they had become so accustomed to him. And the longer you do ministry, the more it's going to be something you do. And when you just do it without the hope of experiencing the extraordinary, because it happens in the ordinary. It happens in an ordinary moment, an ordinary weekend, an ordinary meeting, an ordinary time with God, when that extraordinary breaks in and it transforms your future, it transforms your life. But if you're not obedient in the ordinary, you'll never experience the extraordinary. And if you pursue the extraordinary at the expense of the ordinary, you'll never enjoy the extraordinary. You never know. Today might be the day. This weekend might be the weekend. This Christmas is when it might happen in your life. And the last thing that I wrote down when it comes to these folks is, was it verse 17, 18? It says, when they had seen him, they made known the statement which had been told to them about the child, and everybody who heard it was amazed. I put passionate evangelism is the result of real transformation. And in addition to that, your position doesn't have to limit your impact, because the shepherds were nobodies. And yet their transformation with Jesus allowed them to influence everyone around them. And that's important to remember, because you're not always going to be at the top of the per se pecking order. But my heart, your heart to reach people is a result of truly experiencing the extraordinary. Jesus, his forgiveness, his love. And maybe if I can go into Starbucks and not be nudged by the Holy Spirit to just look around and realize that somewhere between 9 and 190 to, let's say, 100% of the people that are in this room, if Jesus returned today, they'd spend eternity separated from him. And that might impact the way I respond to the barista. It might change the way I look at my phone and ignore everybody around me in that room. Right? So it's important for us to hang with God in such a way that it impacts the way we live our daily lives. And whether we find ourselves in the palace, or in the parking lot, that God can use us. In Matthew chapter 1 and verse 23, it says, "You will call his name Emmanuel." And then it tells us what Emmanuel means. What does it mean? God with us. In John chapter 1, I like the way the Message says it. It says, he pitched his tent amongst us. So, of course, the greatest character of the Christmas story is Jesus himself. And his name reminds you that you're not alone. Your spouse, your best friend, your kids, your parents can only get so close to you. They can't feel your pain. They can have pain for you. But God is with you. Jesus came to be with you. Not just us, but to be with you. This is what I wrote. You're not alone. And then the other thing, that God with us, it made me ask this question: who am I with? Right? Who am I with? Not who do I represent, but who am I with? In other words, who am I doing life with? Because that's dirty work, right? And there's always a tendency to be outside of. God's with us, and he models for us that we then therefore need to be with people so as to be able to effectively minister. Who am I pitching my tent amongst? Who are you pitching your tents amongst?